The night had barely settled in when Marcus Wilson, a 40-year-old man, let out a deep breath, finally feeling like the day was over. His car hummed steadily along the road, the rhythmic sound of tires on asphalt soothing after the hectic day at work. It wasn't anything special, just a quiet drive home, his thoughts drifting between the usual and the unusual. There was something almost peaceful about the way everything felt so ordinary. He could almost taste the comfort of his couch, his warm dinner, the simplicity of his night ahead. But then, in an instant, the serenity shattered. Flashing red and blue lights filled the rearview mirror, casting a stark glow on the rear window. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. The calm that had settled in his chest evaporated like smoke in the cold night air. It didn't take long for the anger to rise. He glanced at the rearview, then back at the road, trying to process what was happening. It was too late to avoid it now. He pulled the car to the side, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. As the flashing lights danced in his mirror, his mind raced. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Yet, there it was, an all too familiar feeling that rose in his chest, cold and uncomfortable, the tension of being pulled over, the sense of impending discomfort, the strange vulnerability that came with being in the spotlight of authority. With a sigh, he pulled over fully, knowing the drill. His stomach tightened, waiting for what was to come. Marcus Wilson wasn't the kind of man you'd notice in a crowd. At 40 years old, he was an average guy by most standards. Average height, average build, with a face that had lived through enough to tell stories but had no time for unnecessary drama. His days were spent working a steady job, nothing glamorous, but enough to get by. He was a family man, someone who had seen the highs and lows of life, who knew that peace often came after surviving the chaos. But Marcus had also learned something important over the years, how to stay calm in situations others would lose their heads in. It wasn't something he had to try for, it was instinct. It was a way of life. Living in a world that sometimes saw him as more of a target than a man, Marcus had become all too familiar with the uncomfortable moments that came with being black in America. He'd been racially profiled more times than he cared to count. A quick glance from a stranger, the suspicion in an officer's eyes, the slow pull-over when you knew you hadn't done a thing wrong, it was a part of his reality. But despite it all, Marcus kept a steady hand on his life. He had no choice but to keep going, to keep living, to keep his calm, even when the world around him seemed anything but. So, when the lights flashed in his mirror, he knew exactly what he was about to face. And he knew just how to handle it. As Marcus sat in his car, waiting for the officers to approach, he could feel the sweat slowly forming on the back of his neck. It wasn't fear, he was no stranger to this, but the familiarity of the situation only made it worse. The low hum of the engine and the occasional thud of his heartbeat filled the space, the tension thickening with every passing second. Then, they appeared. 2 officers. One was tall, with a thick mustache that seemed to add to the arrogance radiating off him. His steps were deliberate, his eyes already scanning Marcus through the driver's side window. The other officer, shorter and stockier, followed closely behind, his presence almost as heavy as the air in the car. The mustached officer knocked on the window sharply, and Marcus rolled it down slowly, keeping his hands clearly visible on the wheel. "Evening, sir," the officer said, his tone clipped but condescending. There was no politeness, just a sharp edge of authority. The stocky officer didn't say a word but stood by the car, arms crossed, eyes hard as steel. He exuded power, his body language radiating intimidation. Marcus could feel the imbalance in the power dynamic. These men were in control, and they knew it. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer with the mustache asked, already sounding impatient. Marcus glanced at his rearview mirror, then back at the officer, his voice calm, unwavering. "No, sir. I haven't done anything wrong." The officer's lips twisted into a thin smile. "You sure about that? Step out of the vehicle, please." Marcus's heart sank. He knew exactly where this was headed. The mustache officer's voice took on a more forceful tone, a kind of superiority that only made the situation worse. He wasn't just pulling Marcus over for a minor infraction. No, this was something more. Something deeper. It was a game of power, and Marcus was already losing. Before Marcus could fully process what was happening, he was already out of the car. His hands were cuffed so tight that his wrists felt like they might snap, the cold metal digging into his skin. The officers didn't ask him to walk to the patrol car. No, they shoved him toward it, his feet dragging along the gravel as the weight of the cuffs pulled at his shoulders. The humiliation settled in quickly, his chest tightening as he realized the full extent of what was happening. You know, the mustached officer said with a smirk, we don't really need to be doing this, you know? But it's your attitude. He let the words hang in the air, his tone dripping with a mix of disdain and superiority. The stocky officer grunted but didn't add anything. Instead, he just grabbed Marcus by the arm, yanking him roughly toward the car. As they shoved him into the back seat, the metal doors slammed shut, trapping him in the confined space with the officer's degrading presence. The chill of the car's interior matched the icy reality Marcus was now living. The ride to the station was agonizingly slow, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. The mustached officer kept muttering to himself, an undercurrent of mockery in his words. Guys like you think you can just drive around here, doing whatever you want. But we'll put you in your place. Marcus tried to block out the insults, the racial undertones that were so familiar to him by now. He'd heard it all before. These weren't just rogue officers, this was a reflection of a deeper, more systemic issue. But that didn't make it hurt any less. As the car rumbled along, Marcus's mind drifted back to other encounters, other moments when his skin color had been used against him. It wasn't just an isolated incident, it was a constant reminder of the way the world saw him. As they neared the police station, the stocky officer finally spoke up. You better hope you're not in too deep. We don't like your kind causing trouble around here. Marcus's chest tightened, a cold knot forming deep within him. It wasn't just an arrest. It was the beginning of something much darker, something he knew all too well. The ride to the station felt like it took an eternity, and when the patrol car finally pulled into the parking lot, Marcus was too numb to feel anything but resignation. The officers didn't say much as they escorted him into the building, but the silence was deafening. They moved him through a cold, sterile hallway, the fluorescent lights flickering above them, and it only seemed to deepen the pit in his stomach. The booking area was just as impersonal as the rest of the station, a stark contrast to the outside world he knew. The walls were dull, gray, and the air had a scent of stale coffee and harsh chemicals. Marcus was pushed up to a counter, the officers speaking in clipped tones to the clerks behind it. The tension in the room was palpable as the officers made their notes, and Marcus could feel the disdain radiating off them. One officer casually tossed him a set of papers to sign, without even bothering to make eye contact. His words were dismissive, his tone mocking. Sign here, here, and here. You'll be in and out in no time, assuming you're not a troublemaker. Another officer, standing off to the side, made a snide comment, barely audible but enough for Marcus to hear. Yeah, people like him, they always think they can get away with everything. Just another day in the system. The words were subtle, yet piercing. It wasn't just the arrest, it was the casual racism, the belief that Marcus was less than human, that he didn't deserve any real respect. They were playing the game with their heads held high, knowing full well that Marcus had no real recourse. The officer behind the counter looked at Marcus like he was nothing more than a nuisance. His pen clicked nervously, a subtle display of impatience, as if Marcus's very presence was an inconvenience. But Marcus didn't react. He had learned long ago that showing any emotion in situations like this would only make things worse. The officers went on, barely noticing him now. They were already on to the next task, but in the back of their minds, Marcus knew they were starting to see more than just a face, they were starting to see his worth. Or rather, their lack of respect for it. The clank of the metal door echoed in the narrow hallway as the officers shoved Marcus into a grimy holding cell. He stumbled forward, feeling the cold steel of the bars behind him as the door slammed shut with a final, unforgiving thud. The bright lights overhead buzzed, casting a harsh glow on everything, on the dirty concrete floor, the flickering fluorescent lights, and the rusted bars of the cell that separated him from the outside world. Marcus sat down on the narrow, uncomfortable bench, his back stiff against the cold wall. He wasn't sure if it was the chill in the air or the weight of everything pressing down on him that made his body tense up. The cell was empty, quiet except for the faint sound of footsteps and distant voices from beyond the walls. He was alone, left to stew in his thoughts. Alone, with nothing but his anger and a mounting sense of injustice. As the minutes dragged on, Marcus found himself reflecting on everything that had led to this moment. His hands were still sore from the tight cuffs that had been slapped on him. He could still hear the mocking voices of the officers, their cruel words replaying over and over in his mind. His frustration boiled over as he thought about how easily they had treated him. Like he was less than them. Like his life didn't matter. He had been through this before, many times, but it never got easier. The world never seemed to get any better. The system, the people, it was all stacked against him. Marcus balled his fists, but he stayed still, knowing that acting out would only make things worse. He had learned the hard way that the system didn't care about his frustration, it would only punish him further. Still, the anger churned within him, a slow-burning fire that he had to keep under control. It felt like the world was tightening its grip around him, and no matter how hard he tried to break free, it only squeezed harder. He had to remain calm. But how much longer could he take it? How much longer before his anger consumed him? The courtroom was packed with people, the low hum of whispers filling the air as the trial began. Marcus sat at the defense table, his lawyer by his side. The room felt heavy with anticipation, a weight that seemed to press down on everyone. The judge, a no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes and a firm posture, called the proceedings to order. Her voice was commanding, and the room fell into a tense silence. "Mr. Wilson, please stand," the judge instructed, her gaze never leaving him. Marcus stood, feeling the weight of the moment. His hand rested lightly on the edge of the table as he faced the court. His eyes scanned the room, briefly settling on the two officers, Mustache and Baldy, who were seated on the opposite side. They didn't seem to notice him, too focused on their own thoughts. But that was about to change. "Your Honor," Marcus's lawyer began, standing up from the table and addressing the judge, "we're here today because Mr. Wilson was wrongfully arrested, racially profiled, and treated in a manner that violates his rights as an American citizen. But what they don't know, Your Honor, is that Mr. Wilson isn't just any man. He's a federal agent." The courtroom gasped. The officers, Mustache and Baldy, both looked up in shock, their faces slowly turning pale. The shift in their demeanor was instantaneous, the confident arrogance from earlier had all but evaporated. They exchanged uncertain glances, trying to hide the unease creeping in. Marcus's lawyer continued, presenting irrefutable evidence. "As you can see from the documents provided, Mr. Wilson has been a federal agent for over 15 years. He was on assignment that night. These officers detained him without cause, assuming the worst based on nothing more than his appearance. This wasn't just a case of incompetence, it was racial profiling." The judge's eyes narrowed as she looked at the officers. "You two didn't think to ask, did you? You didn't care to investigate further. You assumed, and now your assumption has cost you," she said, her voice sharp and cutting through the silence. The officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Their faces were flushed with embarrassment as they tried to regroup, but the damage was done. The courtroom had heard the truth, and it was undeniable. The judge's words rang out, a clear condemnation of their actions. The room seemed to grow quieter, the weight of justice about to be delivered. 8. The showdown, 400 words. The officers, Mustache and Baldy, sat in stunned silence as their world crumbled around them. They had thought they were untouchable, their authority unquestioned. But now, they were the ones on trial, exposed for what they were, racists who had misused their power. Mustache's voice cracked when he tried to speak up, attempting to defend his actions. "Your Honor, we didn't know, we thought." But the judge cut him off, her tone icy. "You didn't know? Or did you simply not care to know? Your actions were based on assumptions, prejudices that led you to treat Mr. Wilson with disrespect. You took the law into your own hands, and you abused your power. Baldy tried to speak next, his face red with frustration. It wasn't like that. We were just doing our job. The judge's eyes locked onto him, and her voice rang out with authority. Doing your job doesn't mean treating someone as a criminal simply because of their race. That's not law enforcement. That's prejudice. Marcus's lawyer stood tall, presenting more evidence, dashcam footage, witness testimonies, and records proving that Marcus had been detained solely based on his race. The officers tried to argue, but the evidence was overwhelming. The tension in the room thickened as the officers realized what was happening. They were caught, their credibility shattered. Their careers, their reputations, they were all hanging by a thread. Mustache and Baldy sat back, their shoulders slumped, defeated. The weight of their actions, the harm they had caused, was sinking in. The judge looked at them one last time, a brief silence filling the room before she spoke. Your actions were not just an error of judgment. They were a violation of the trust placed in you as law enforcement officers. And now, you will face the consequences. The officers, once so confident in their power, had nowhere to hide now. Their downfall was inevitable, and the courtroom knew it. The tension in the courtroom hung heavy in the air, but the truth had been spoken, and now, it was time for justice. The judge, after taking a moment to collect herself, addressed Marcus directly, her tone softening but firm. Mr. Wilson, she began, I want to formally apologize to you for the actions that have taken place. No one should ever be subjected to the treatment you experienced, and for that, I am deeply sorry. The officers in this case abused their power, and I want to ensure that you know this court stands with you in the fight against racial profiling. Marcus nodded, his expression composed but resolute. He hadn't expected the apology, but it felt like a small victory in a long battle. He knew it wasn't over, there was still much to be done, but this was a significant moment. The judge turned to the officers, her gaze stern. As for you two, she said, addressing Mustache and Baldy, your actions have consequences. You will both be suspended while an internal investigation takes place. I will personally ensure that this matter is given the attention it deserves. The officers didn't speak, their heads bowed in shame as the weight of their actions settled in. The judge's words were a powerful signal that accountability would follow, that their misuse of authority would not go unchecked. Outside the courtroom, news outlets began reporting on the case, the community taking notice of what had transpired. People were talking about racism, about power, about the importance of standing up for what's right. The case had become more than just a legal matter, it was now a statement. Marcus stood tall, feeling the sting of the injustice, but also the fire of something much stronger. This moment, though painful, would spark conversations, inspire others, and hopefully change the system that had wronged him. As Marcus walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the day's events settled on his shoulders. He was free, and justice had been served in his case. But in the quiet of the empty hallway, he knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. The fight against racism wasn't over, and there was still much to be done. But for today, he could breathe easier knowing that the system had been challenged, and for once, it had worked. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the courthouse steps as Marcus stepped outside. The world hadn't changed in an instant, but he knew that this moment would ripple outward, affecting people who might never know his name but would feel the impact of what had happened. The message was clear, racism in any form had no place in society, and it was up to all of us to fight against it. Standing up, speaking out, and refusing to let injustice go unchecked, that was the power we all held. Change doesn't come easy, Marcus thought as he walked toward his car, but if we stand together, if we speak the truth, we can make it happen. Today had been proof of that. And for Marcus Wilson, it was just the beginning.